And that your university is free. My university, Johns Hopkins University, is a private, non-profit institution, but we charge tuition for our students. And therefore, in the eyes of the national accounts specialists, we are just like General Motors or one of your private banks, and we get put into the corporation sector in the accounts. And once we are put into the corporation sector, poof, we disappear as a nonprofit. And so the same is true of nonprofits that receive significant government support. In many countries of the world, including the German state, there's very heavy public subsidy of the nonprofits, either directly or through grants to the citizens. And they get put into the government sector. And as a result, all that's visible in this NPISH sector is a very small residue of all the nonprofits that receive most of their money from philanthropy, from private gifts. And the rest of them, poof, they disappear and are invisible. And so this is explaining why it is that our data is so wrong. So I've always likened my work to putting on a different pair of glasses. You know, those of you who wear glasses, you know that the world is still the same with your glasses off as when they are on. But when you put your glasses on, some aspects of reality that you couldn't see come into focus. And so it is with statistical systems. We are vulnerable to the definitions that are built into the statistical systems. They affect what parts of the world that we see. And it happened that for the statistical economics community, the nonprofit sector, and the same is true of volunteering, simply were not important enough to warrant a focus in the statistical system. And they therefore got wiped away, and then their non-existence became a rationale for not doing any further work on them. Even when we knew that something very dramatic was occurring in Brazil, in Mexico, in Africa, and even Western Europe and into Asia, that there was this surge of growth of some kind of set of institutions that didn't fit into the framework of the system of national accounts, and therefore the blinders, the lack of a set of lenses through which to see this reality meant that it simply was not getting the attention that it deserved. And so I set out to in a sense, change that, to create a body of data. I first went to the statistical authorities and I said, listen, I think you're missing something. And they said to me, you know, go away, it's 1/10 of 1% of the GDP, it's not worth any effort. And of course, I am a very stubborn person, as anybody who knows me will quickly tell you. And I was not willing to accept that as an answer. So we launched something that became called the Johns Hopkins Nonprofit Sector Project, the Johns Hopkins Nonprofit Sector Project, with help from a lot of private foundations that, for a variety of reasons, were suddenly interested in this sector. This occurred right around the time that European Union was coming together, and people in the third sector were discovering they simply could not explain to the people forming the European Union that they existed because there was no data. So all the focus was on the businesses and how to make the union supportive of business, overlooking this enormous set of institutions that is the nonprofit sector. We started out, therefore, in about 8 countries. As soon as we had developed data that was solid in those 8 countries, every country wanted, it seemed, to have this kind of data. So we ultimately expanded the project, first to 23 countries, including Latin America, and then into Asia and South into Africa. So we're now working in over 40 countries. This may be the largest comparative social science research project in history. And it was built largely from private sources. To some extent, we got public sector sources. We built teams of associates in every country. And so there was a team in Leila Lamdim, somebody who you know, who's So Leila was our local associate, and she built a team of researchers here, and we had researchers in other countries. We had probably maybe 200 researchers involved in the project. Each country had an advisory committee of maybe 15 or 20 people, so you multiply that times 40 countries, and there's another 800 people involved in the project, and then we had 50 or 60 different funders involved in the project, and each one had 1 or 2 people. So we had 1,000 people that we were managing through this project. And out of it have come a whole variety of books, the most recent of which is called The Global Civil Society. This is volume 2 of a series, and we are now at work on volume 3. And I will talk in a minute about what we've discovered, but let me just tell you 2 other steps in this process so you know the base of data, since this is a university and you are interested in some of the methodological issues as well as some of the substantive issues. We were determined from the very start not only to do a research project, but we really wanted ultimately to change the whole structure of the national accounts so far as this sector was concerned. In other words, we wanted to institutionalize in this system of national accounts the concept of the third sector and volunteering. And mainly, in part, is because we're very lazy. Doing data gathering is very hard, and doing data gathering and collecting private resources to support it is almost impossible. And as soon as we began to create this data, and of course we would create it 1 year and we would report it, and then the newspaper people would be calling us, so do you have any more up-to-date data? And you know, for me it was hard enough to do it once, and to do it twice, but to do it 3 times, 4 times. So from the very beginning, my goal was to go back to the office of the chief statistician of the United Nations and show him our data. And that's what we ultimately did. After maybe 4 years of work in generating these data and generating a whole series of books that was published by Manchester University Press, I made an appointment to go back. I put all of our books out on the table. I opened up their records and I showed them, you know, here's what you estimate the nonprofit sector is in Germany. Here's our estimate. It's 10 times bigger. One of us is wrong. So if you're wrong, I expect you to allow us to fix this. And please, you know, contact the German Statistics Agency and the UK Statistics Agency, because we had worked with them. And basically what we did is we went into their records. We found these nonprofits that were in the other sectors. We put them together. It was not rocket science, but it was a different lens. So in 6 months, they finally came back and said, okay, we see we have, it's not that we're wrong, we have a different concept, your concept is valid, our concept is valid, let's work together. And out of this process, in a matter of maybe 2 and 3 years, we produced a new handbook that became an official United Nations handbook to give guidance to IFCH, to other statistics agencies, how to find the third sector in the statistical system. So this handbook. It's called the Handbook on Nonprofit Institutions in the System of National Accounts. It is certainly one of, and it's published by the United Nations. It was totally written by my team at Johns Hopkins. I frequently say that this is the most boring of many boring books that I've written, but it is also the most powerful because it drives the behavior of maybe 75,000 statisticians around the world who are all reading this book, and they are changing the way they treat statistics as a result of this. We then launched, well, there are 2 things that this handbook calls for. One of them is to produce a satellite account on the nonprofit institutions. And what this means is that side by side with the regular reports on the GDP of each country, the countries are expected, the statistics offices are expected to produce a satellite account that pulls together all of these nonprofit institutions that they have scattered through their other accounts and report on it. And the data that exists in these existing files are enormous. The They know the expenditures, they know the revenue of nonprofits, they know the number of employees, they know the fields in which they operate, they know their assets, they know their contribution to GDP, what is the value added of nonprofits overall and in particular fields. So it's an enormous, it's like opening a treasure chest of data. And the neat thing about it is that it is comparative from country to country because it's driven by the basic rules of the system of national accounts, and it is collected automatically. As we got into it, of course, we discovered that countries were doing a very bad job of even finding these nonprofits. They were supposed to include them in their existing data. They had buried them in strange places, but they were supposed to include them. As we began to pull them out, we realized that they had been very sloppy in capturing them. So we ended up doing things that improved the accuracy of the entire satellite account, the entire national account process. And the second thing that the handbook did that was very important was, for the very first time, it identified the need to measure the work that volunteers do. Volunteer labor was considered prior to our work to be outside what's called the production boundary of the economy. So it's the same as the household work of women is also outside the production boundary, as you may know. It is simply not considered part of the economy. So too is all volunteer work. It simply was never counted. And our research in our comparative project had demonstrated that something like nearly half of all the work that's done, all the full-time equivalent labor in nonprofit organizations, is actually done by volunteers. And so we continuously beat away on them. You know, we would say, okay, the nonprofits are inside the production boundary. Oh yes, yes they are. Well, 44% of their labor is volunteers, so how can that be outside the production boundary if the organizations are inside it? And they had great difficulty answering this question. It was just logically impossible to defend it. And ultimately there was an agreement to accept the idea that volunteer labor should be counted, that it should be treated as an aspect of work, and that it should be included as part of the GDP, at least so far as our satellite account. So these were pretty significant breakthroughs conceptually in the whole structure of thinking in the national accounts work. This handbook was accepted by something called the United Nations Statistical Commission, which is a 300 or 400 person commission that meets every year in February in New York. I had no idea that there was such a thing. It is the governing body for the system of national accounts and for international economic statistics. So IFCH, for example, every year will send 2 or 3 people to the United Nations Statistical Commission, as well as every other country in the world, and they vote on these technical issues, and our handbook was submitted and did get the approval, which meant that it was an official and is an official United Nations handbook. With that as a background, we then launched an implementation effort. So this is very strange behavior for professors to get it.
Okay.
Is it working?
Okay.
Great, Christine.
Yeah.
So this is very strange behavior for a professor to not only do a research project and then to change the structure of the national statistics. But we didn't want this simply to become a book on the shelf, and so we launched a major implementation project. We launched it here in Brazil, and we launched it in many other parts of the world. And at this point, we have convinced 36 countries to commit to implementing this United Nations handbook, and 19 of them have completed at least one version, and one of those countries that has completed at least a pilot effort is Brazil. And on this trip I am going to go to Rio to try to talk the statistics agency into not only doing a pilot, but incorporate this into the regular routine of PPG. One final methodological step that I need to tell you about, and then we'll talk about the thing you may have come to hear about, which is the 10 myths. We discovered as we began to work on the implementation that countries simply didn't know how to measure the volunteer work. There was no international standard. There was no definition that had been routinized. There was no clear, agreed methodology for putting a value on volunteer work. These were all very difficult technical issues. So countries began to write to us and say, how do we do this? Give us, we need guidance from some entity. And so we had to go back to work on the statistical system. And this time we decided that the most efficient way to gather data on volunteer work, because this was new data that had to be collected, was to focus on the labor force surveys that are done in countries all over the world. So it's one of the most powerful parts of national statistical systems, the labor force survey. So for example, in Brazil, the labor force survey is carried on continuously. Every month, they're picking a sample, going into households and doing household surveys. Again, thousands of people involved in this around the world. And so we figured if we could integrate some questions about volunteering in the labor force surveys as a routine matter, we would have the best chance of getting the data that we wanted on volunteering. And so I made an appointment and went and visited the International Labor Organization in Geneva, and I basically gave them the same story that I had given to the statistics people at the UN 3 or 4 years before. You are missing an enormous part of the world's labor force. It is producing things of value. How can you possibly be putting out data on the world's labor force and missing this entire part of the labor force? You should be embarrassed by this. This is not acceptable. Eventually we were able to convince the International Labor Organization's Department of Statistics to let us at least make an attempt to present this idea before their governing body, which is every 5 years they gather all the labor statisticians in the world, an international conference. It so happened that the 18th conference was coming up in about 18 months from when I met with them. So they said, okay, if you can develop a manual, of course you must go through our routines, you have to have a technical experts group, and we will invite you and give you a chance to present it at the 18th conference of the International Labor Statisticians. And so that's what we did, and ultimately, this is a picture of all the satellite accounts that have been produced up to now under the UN handbook. And then we ultimately went to the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, presented this at the end of 2008. It was approved, and ultimately after another year and a half of completion, this second piece of new machinery in the international statistical system was released. It was just released in March of 2011, about 1 year ago, and we are now in the process of encouraging the implementation of this new manual. And the manual essentially is a vehicle for measuring the quantity, the type, the source, and the field of volunteer work. Through a very simple survey module that's attached to labor force surveys. It's about a page and a half. It tells us who's volunteering, it tells us how much volunteering, it tells us what job they do. And once we have the occupation, in labor force surveys, it's easy to connect an occupation to a salary. So as soon as we know the occupation and the time, we can quickly get the value of this volunteer work. We know from the rest of the data collected in the labor force survey, certain demographic characteristics of the volunteer, they men or they women, are they highly educated or not, what's their income level, what's their normal paid occupation. It becomes just, again, a rich gold mine of data that all of us can begin to analyze. So this is the backdrop of what I'm going to really talk about, how we do in time-wise.
25 minutes.
Okay, so 25 minutes, I'll stop. So what have we learned from this body of data, both our research data and the broader national accounts data that is beginning to accumulate? So I've organized this around 10 myths, because I find that most people have beliefs about the nonprofit sector, but the beliefs have not typically been informed by data because there was no data. So this was a wonderful arena in which any ideology could be put forward because nobody could challenge it. You pick the nonprofit sector. So in our country, for example, the conservative wings of our political system always point to the nonprofit sector as a very convenient way to have an excuse for opposing government social involvement. Don't worry, the nonprofit sector will take care of it. And the assumption, of course, was that nonprofits were outside of the government sphere and they could be the vehicle for. And so long as there was no data, of course, you could never challenge it. We began to create data, and this data turned out to challenge some of the myths. So what are the myths? Myth number one, it's a very basic one in this field, and it's hard now to believe it, but when we started the work, the idea that there was something called a nonprofit or a civil society sector was doubted by people. That there was enough commonality among the different institutions in the environment, doing grassroots work, doing healthcare. These were perceived to be just separate entities and institutions that did not really share something that was really sufficiently common to call it a sector. And great disputes. So, for example, in this part of the world, people use the concept of NGO to depict the sector. An NGO is a very restricted non-governmental organization, ONG, I guess in Spanish, also in Portuguese. Well, it turns out that ONGs are a particular type of nonprofit. They tend to be grassroots, they tend to be development-oriented. When you limit the definition to them, you exclude hospitals, you exclude the whole network of Caritas, this part of the world. You exclude, in some countries, universities that are private, that are not public universities. You exclude environmental groups, you exclude arts groups. And each country had its own preferred way of thinking of these entities, but there was no common and certainly no comparative definition. So the first task that we had was to see whether we could come up with a common definition. And early in our project, we probably spent the best part of 2 years with a team of colleagues, of which Leila Landine was a very vocal part. If you know Leila, she's both very vocal and very passionate in a true Brazilian fashion. So she represented your country very well. We had several definitions, several criteria for our definition. First of all, we wanted a definition that was sufficiently broad to accommodate the real incredible diversity of this sector. So we needed a broad definition. On the other hand, we needed a definition with some borders to it. It had to have some clarity so that it differentiated the civil society organizations from other parts of the society, particularly from government and businesses. And so we had to draw some borders to the definition because we didn't want to include everything in it. Thirdly, we wanted to develop the definition from the bottom up. In other words, we wanted it to be informed by the reality of countries. We didn't want to come up with a top-down definition that was American or British or whatever. We wanted to start with the reality on the ground and see if there was enough overlap in that reality to allow us to identify certain characteristics that were common among the largest number of countries. And then finally, and very importantly, we had to have a definition that was operational. Those of you who are sociologists know that there's a big difference between a definition that is conceptually wonderful but cannot be translated into any empirical measures. And we were constantly challenged to introduce definitional items that simply would not work in operational terms. The most common notion here was the notion of public interest. Many people thought that you had to define the nonprofit sector as organizations that are serving the public, the common good. And that's a very compelling argument, because that's what this sector is supposed to do. But if you introduce the purpose into the definition, you create a tautology. How does that work? Does that word tautology work? Because you would never, by definition, ever find a nonprofit that was not serving the common good. But of course, it's possible that some nonprofits don't serve the common good. So if you build the purpose into the definition, first of all, what is the common good? The common good in your country may be a different concept than the common good in my country. And my notion of the common good may be different from yours. And these